I'm delighted to introduce, first of all, then, Vicky Harman, who is a great colleague of ours here in sociology, and amongst various other things, is an expert on families and particularly mothering and motherhoods. And Vicky's going to now introduce Ranjana's book.
Thanks very much. As a sociologist of family life, I was fascinated to read Ranjana's book, Early Motherhood in Digital Societies. The book draws on in-depth and moving accounts of early motherhood, combined with engaging online case studies. I'm going to show you a slide now that summarises some of the key concepts that Ranjana drew on in relation to this research. For this project, Ranjana drew on feminist sociology, sociology of mothering, and communication studies to employ a range of concepts around the notion of the perinatal ideal. And for me, as a scholar in relation to mothering, the concept of intensive mothering is one that stands out as particularly important at the current time. This relates to a cultural shift in both motherhood and childhood, where mothering is increasingly individualised and competitive, and childhood is seen as risky business, children are seen as at risk and also priceless. This means that parents, and particularly mothers, are seen as having to do more and more, despite being in paid work often. They are blamed and praised for the outcomes of the child in a range of areas, including health, educational achievements, and other areas. I'd like to talk to you in particular about chapter 6, which was a favourite chapter of mine, and it particularly focused on perinatal anxiety. And this connects with some of my own research on displaying good mothering. Here, Ranjana talks about how perinatal anxiety is often treated as a clinical notion, as heavily individualised and framed as mother blame in terms of its impact on the priceless infant, and supported through peer groups of other struggling new mums as state and institutional support recedes. She shows how there are many apps and devices designed to alleviate anxieties on specific matters to do with infant feeding, health and well-being, but actually often these maintain or even exacerbate concerns. The chapter highlights two particularly interesting areas. One is the concern about antenatal and postnatal anxiety around giving birth in the so-called right way, which is a drug-free and pain-free experience. And there are concerns about the impact of on the child if this doesn't go as planned. For example, concerns about a lack of bonding. There are also concerns highlighted about infant feeding, and mothers were seeking support online in relation to these areas. So in relation to giving birth, often they described taking part in courses such as hypnobirthing, online and offline training, and sometimes this led to anger and disappointment when things didn't work out as planned. One thing that the chapter really highlights well is the online support that many parents are accessing at the current time. So in a context where media is integrated into our daily lives, many parents are using support forums as a space to connect with others, to find camaraderie, to reach out and ask questions at any time in day or night. And for some, this support can move fluidly across online and offline spaces. But an important thing that the book shows is that this support is not without problems, disagreements, tensions and exclusions, and also arguably it creates something of a burden on the very mothers that need support to be giving it to others at a time when state support is receding. So an important contribution of the book is to show that technology doesn't just offer a magical solution, it's not a magic bullet, but it in fact raises a new set of questions. I think the findings of this book are relevant not just to the perinatal period, which Ranjana shows is an intensive one, physically and mentally, but it actually speaks to mothering and parenting more generally. And it's relevant to mothers of children of various ages. I myself experienced some of these senses of individualisation when navigating homeschooling during lockdown. So at a time when COVID-19 has called for social distancing and caused us to rethink many of the ways that things are done, it's an ideal time to consider how best to support parents and to broaden the discussion beyond individual responsibility. So I encourage you to buy a copy of the book, which is available at a discount of 20% off if you use the code that I'm going to put in the chat now. If you apply the discount code to an ebook, that means you have it for about £25, which is excellent. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Ranjana's got to say today.
Thanks so much, Vicky. And now just a very brief one from me, just to sort of introduce Ranjana herself now, who's going to sort of talk about her recent COVID-related research and draw through various themes from her book in relation to that. So over to you, Ranjana.
Thank you very much, Vicky, for that fantastic introduction, and thank you, Paul, and thank you all of you who have come today. And we have a very diverse audience today amongst us. I can recognize some of my own departmental colleagues, but I can also see colleagues from outside the University of Surrey, but also many people who are in practice and policy within the area of perinatal mental health. So the talk is kind of trying to strike that balance between being a very academic talk and being sort of useful for practice and policy. So my intention today is to speak a little bit further about the book, and Vicky has sort of done a great job in kind of framing the theoretical framework and the theories and concepts that I worked with from sociology, the department in which I sit, and communication studies, my field and my discipline of work. So I am going to begin by talking a little bit about the book and then carry some of its findings into a very recent project, work in progress, where I did field work in the spring of 2020 during the English lockdown owing to the coronavirus pandemic. And that is what is going to be the bulk of my talk today. So my book, Early Motherhood in Digital Societies, consists of 7 chapters and brings together work on 3 online platforms and interviews, face-to-face in-depth qualitative interviews between myself and 35, if I remember correctly, mothers. And it's a qualitative book, and it takes sort of kind of an approach that sits between communication studies and sociology. And I was very keen to see how the online shapes and is shaped by experiences of the perinatal. And the book sort of begins with kind of looking at the policy frameworks and issues in practice around perinatal, particularly focusing on perinatal mental health, and the debates around everything from conception to pregnancy to methods of infant feeding, right up till the return to work. In the chapter the perinatal ideal, I kind of bring together the sorts of concepts that Vicky has kind of highlighted, broadly based around the gendered pressures that mothers feel to mother perfectly and intensively at a point in time in the UK when there have been repeated cuts in funding from the NHS and the health visiting sector particularly has been very burdened. I look in detail at the notion of the good birth, where I critique this discourse about the ideal birth that we see around us, that creates an enormous pressure on people giving birth. I consider online support rhetoric, particularly looking at its many empowering and cathartic potentials, but also the many competitive potentials of it. But instead of putting the blame on individual women being competitive, I draw attention to the broader societal structures within which such competition flourishes. I look at the value of people's relationships with each other, interpersonal ties, which I find to be having lasting implications in terms of the connections mothers build with each other in various groups or fora. And I argue that although these are small, short-lived relationships, in many cases they have lasting impact. Again, many positives, but also many negatives. I look particularly at the chapter that Vicky has mentioned, and that's going to be a point in terms of my, which is the notion of perinatal anxiety, where I consider very carefully how discourses of anxiety and mothers being anxious are framed as, are often seen as this kind of a clinical individual problem of women being quite anxious, and not looking at broader conditions and societal structures that caused that in the first place, or that shaped that in the first place, and how that's presented then as something that harms infants and harms fetuses, harms the society's hopes for the future, because a lot of discourse around maternal anxiety is about how bad it is for children. And finally, bringing all of it together, I consider what the role of digital spaces could be. Amidst a lot of euphoria and hope about the digital, I consider carefully what a space for the digital might be in supporting the perinatal. So this work sits within a broader context of work that I have been immersed in over the last few years, funded by various sources, the British Academy, the Wellcome Trust, the University of Surrey, on the broad topic of perinatal mental health. There's the monograph, of course, but there's also my project on migrant mothers' perinatal mental health experiences, funded by the Wellcome Trust. I've been doing work with Paul Hodkinson on fathers, new fatherhood, and perinatal mental health. And we've recently, Paul and I have recently started a new project on working with the NCT and the Institute of Health Visiting on kind of both mothers' perinatal mental health, which has sort of the impact dimension, engaging with practitioners. So within that context, what I'm going to talk about today is the COVID-19 project, which looked at the disproportionate impacts of the coronavirus pandemic-related lockdown measures on pregnancy and maternity, with a focus today on maternal anxiety. And the project, to simplify things very much, was interested in 3 different things, and one of that appears in red today because that is what I'm going to focus on. So one of the concerns was the impacts of things. What were the impacts on pregnancy and maternity with the sudden and blanket closure of all services? And then, because I am a communication studies researcher, I particularly looked at the role of the sudden turn to digital and all things moving online, and how that was experienced in reality, amidst widespread issues around digital access and digital inequality. And I make several recommendations for practice and policy. Now the latter 2, the ones in purple, I am absolutely not going to be able to touch upon today, but the plans are to touch upon those quite centrally in a few further talks that I'll indicate towards the end of this talk. So today's focus is quite fittingly perhaps in my department here, the Department of Sociology, on the impacts and experiences on pregnancy and maternity. So in particular, I'm going to look at the intensification of perinatal anxiety in the wake of the pandemic lockdown, and the role of gender in the process, just as Vicky has spoken about and just as I have spoken about, in terms of the enormity of the pressures on mothers and mothers alone to look after society's hopes for the future, the priceless fetus, the priceless infant, at great individual cost. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a quote from Tricia. And Tricia's quote highlights a number of different aspects that the project touches upon. So Tricia says, I always find Mondays particularly difficult. I always notice that I always have a wobble on a Monday. She's very much out of sorts on a Monday and we struggle. Like last week, I ended up bringing the health visitor on Monday just in absolute bits because I was like, I can't do this anymore. She's been crying all day and I'm fed up. And it's another week of not knowing how long it's going to go on for. I suffer with health anxiety anyway, and I forced myself to go out every day since, like 40 minutes every day. When I go out for a walk with her, it does help. But I also think it's not so much the virus now for me. It's the isolation. It's not having anybody around. Like I realize I'll ring my mum in the morning and she's probably the only person I'll speak to all day until partner gets home. It's also little things, you know, like health visits for the baby, not having those. Tricia experienced the COVID-19 English lockdown as a new mother recovering from a complex and very traumatic birth, with a pre-existing diagnosis of health anxiety, and suddenly disconnected from all the informal and formal support she had carefully lined up for herself to cope with the postnatal. In the face of blanket lockdown closures that deemed almost everything to do with the perinatal as non-essential services, Tricia sank into debilitating depression and anxiety, resulting, amongst other things, in significant stresses on her relationship with her partner, which, after a substantial amount of time, led to her partner also admitting that he too was significantly struggling as a consequence of her significant desperation. At the time of fieldwork, Trisha was in a place where she felt entirely unheard, unseen, and unsupported, both formally and informally. So today's talk speaks from a project which explored perinatal mental health impacts exacerbated or created by COVID-19. And we know that the social and economic impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, the social distancing measures and changes to various things also changed formal and informal postnatal and antenatal support services. And these, in many instances, were deemed non-essential. I investigated these outcomes through a small qualitative project involving in-depth interviews with 14 pregnant women and new mothers, such as Trisha here. And in this paper today, I'm going to focus particularly on the intensification of maternal anxiety. And I talk about how, far from being an individualizable clinical condition, as it is often treated within perinatal services, how it linked to existing vulnerabilities and existing inequalities which heightened the load on some mothers far more than others. I focus also on the role of gender in relation to the intense ways in which these participants felt a pressure to protect their fetus and protect their infants. And the third strand considers how perinatal anxiety amidst the COVID-19 pandemic continued to be experienced as an individual responsibility and an individual burden as institutions and support structures suddenly retreated in the broader context of cuts to these services over at least the last 10 years. So Vicky has already talked about how I look at maternal anxiety. And I consider, for instance, those are some tabloid headlines up there, all of which are talking about how mothers with anxiety greatly harm their children. A lot of clinical and biological literature on anxiety. And all these headlines are about how children born to anxious mothers develop various problems. Now, there's a problem here. First of all, it looks at maternal anxiety as an individualized clinical pathological condition. Societal structuring and societal influences on this become invisible. Second, it constantly looks at it through the lens of the priceless child, the priceless fetus and the priceless infant, and resorts to a blame discourse, blaming mothers for the impact on the priceless child and the priceless fetus. And interestingly, in terms of support, as institutional support is repeatedly cut and as healthcare professionals have a higher and higher caseload all the time, the burden of supporting mothers move on to mothers themselves. Peer support, where struggling mothers are supposed to support each other as wider institutional support retreats. So this I call the cultural coding of maternal anxiety, where it is treated as this individualized clinical pathological condition, the individual's responsibility as institutions retreat, and important only because it apparently impacts the priceless fetus and the priceless child. And mothers become invisible. And sociology has written about these things with the concept of matricide and maternal invisibility and the fetal celebrity, where the child becomes a celebrity and mother becomes invisible. Okay, so what did I do? So this paper presents findings relating to the impacts of COVID-19 on perinatal mental health and well-being during pregnancy and maternity. So I interviewed 14 new mothers and people in the third trimester of their pregnancy, and recruitment specifically left mental health as a very fluid and sort of self-defined area, because we know in the UK, numerous people don't even get diagnosed and fall through the net in terms of accessing support. So this was left fluid by default. And I know that the response to the recruitment call was enormous, and I recruited within the first day. And I had, within the first few days, about 3 times the number of spaces was the degree of interest. And this says something about the number of people who wanted to speak about such things. And out of the 14 participants, 3 were in the third trimester of the pregnancy. 11 had a very small baby, with babies aged between 4 weeks to 16 weeks. 4 participants out of the 14 came from South Asian backgrounds, and all 14 came from a very wide diversity of regions in England. 6 out of the 14 had diagnosed mental health difficulties. And participants were interviewed online using a semi-structured interview guide, and conversations were sort of free-flowing discussions. Now, a brief reflection is necessary at this point in terms of my own positionality in relation to the fieldwork. Now, in many ways, this project was the 4th in a line of 4 different projects I'd already been doing for the last few years on perinatal mental health, so this was far from unusual. However, significantly, the specific circumstances of COVID-19 meant that this project was also personal, because I myself gave birth at the start of the global pandemic, and I was myself locked down with an infant during the postnatal period. As a migrant mother myself, albeit in many ways a very privileged one, this entailed being disconnected from my own family in Asia. And as a new mother in the English lockdown, I too encountered firsthand the impacts of the closure, the blanket closure of every single service that I thought I needed. Now, this positioning in many ways was useful in establishing a rapport with my participants, because we both had infants to cradle, nurse, or soothe as we spoke in the interviews, and there were frequent parallels between our experiences. And I decided very early on that rather than evading, I would embrace this positionality, and that would offer many inroads into richer data. But equally, the interviews were also indicative of many differences in privilege between myself and my participants. Whilst all of us during the interview realized we had seen these notices, and that is one that I saw when I had a few weeks old baby, informing me that something had been shut down. I was very conscious, of course, that I had access to professional knowledge about these support services in many ways that my participants didn't, and that my rapport with them was not a peer-to-peer rapport that I might have established in any other context, like a baby group. And the similarity was that we had all encountered this message that is up there as I checked it this morning, and it says Guildford Family Centre has cancelled all group activities due to the current crisis. And the subject matter made for intense interview experiences, not least because they added to my own exhaustion of raising an infant amidst a pandemic, but because of the absorption of other people's sufferings. And I wrote regularly through the fieldwork on my own professional social media profile, engaging with my fellow colleagues and practitioners in the area, and that was, of course, very useful. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my first theme now, the intensification of perinatal anxiety amidst the pandemic, and how it was sort of societally shaped rather than sort of an individualized clinical condition. So I found that perinatal anxiety was intensified in the vast majority of the cases of the, in terms of people I spoke to. And far from being an individualizable clinical condition, it was shaped actually by existing vulnerabilities and inequalities, which heightened the load on some women more than others, particularly those who had diagnosed pre-existing mental health difficulties, and those who were on other axes of inequalities at a time when institutional support had suddenly been drastically cut, in a broader context where institutional support had been subjected to repeated funding cuts and spending cuts, and there were simmering issues ongoing even before the pandemic arrived. So Anna says, I've had a few days where I've just cried and stressed myself out. I'm in a constant state of stress. Do I take him out? What if that person's coming too close to me? What if they've got it? I can't take him to the supermarket. What if it's on my clothes? What if it's on my shopping? It is crucial to recognize now that this cannot be individualized or reduced to one person being a certain way. And that there is not a linear causal relationship between worries about the virus itself and its impact on any one person, but rather the broader imperative many of these new mothers felt on themselves and themselves alone and not their partners to protect at all costs the fetus and the infant, and a great sense of blame and shame if they failed to do so, if they went for a walk, the sense of blame and guilt if they did. Now, in a few instances, partners needed to work outside the home, often on the front line. For 3 out of my 4 ethnic minority participants, partners were working outside, generating anxiety about them contracting COVID-19 amidst the wider evidence that was accumulating in this regard. Now, this was a significant worry for Arfana, whose partner worked long hours in a grocery store, and for Salma, whose partner contracted COVID-19 whilst working on the NHS. Arfana's migration status as dependent on her spouse, a very low household income, and resultant socioeconomic pressures on her partner and herself significantly exacerbated during the pandemic, and that fueled a condition of great anxiety and depression for her as she isolated at home with a new baby. She said, to be honest with you, I was more worried about my partner because he was working in a supermarket, and you never know who's carrying the virus, who's affected. I felt really helpless. And she was following the data on COVID-19 and BAME communities very, very intently. Salma, who had pre-existing depression for many years, had developed a very fine-tuned picture of her own symptoms and had intricate plans to cope. But despite being a health professional herself, the things that she had planned to use for her own recovery were suddenly shut down, and the chief amongst them was the baby weigh-in clinic, her primary and first port of call, where she said, my face could be seen. So she asked me who would then see my face. The inability to get regular baby checks done became a significant additional impact that suddenly skyrocketed her perinatal anxiety. I think that it means that sort of all children's clinics had shut down. So there's not been any, she's not had any weights done. There's been a significant issue because she's dropped centiles, and that's only been on random visits that we found that out. That's been a significant issue for my mental health. And the way this anxiety was articulated was sometimes about the baby, and sometimes about the fetus, leading to harsher and harsher self-imposed lockdown restrictions. But in all these cases, it was coming from elsewhere. It was coming from the exacerbation of enormous maternal burden to protect the fetus, on the non-availability of institutional support, on the non-availability of wider sources of support and resources that have been going on for years now, and shaped by pre-existing difficulties, pre-existing vulnerabilities, pre-existing inequalities, which were all exacerbated, beckoning our attention away from treating this anxiety as an individual clinical condition, beckoning our attention towards the societal, towards the institutional. The second facet of perinatal anxiety that I wanted to talk about links to the broader and long research for decades now within feminist sociology, gendered pressures on mothers to mother perfectly. And these studies exist around conception, birth, different kinds of birthing, different methods of infant feeding, weaning, return to work, childcare. And Vicky, for instance, in her own work has talked a lot about intensive mothering around the notion of feeding children. And mother blame and the heavy burdening of women as responsible for infant well-being, and the infant being this priceless gem, society's hopes for the future, resulted in this particular sample in the heightening of lockdown restrictions imposed on mothers by their partners, by their wider family, and sometimes by themselves, operating within broader gendered discourses of maternal sacrifice for the infant, for the fetus. In two cases, women's movements got significantly restricted owing to anxiety from others, partners or family members, about the infant or the fetus. Irfana notes to me, and she's significantly isolated in England, and this was perhaps the most difficult interview, about her in-laws telling her, if they know like anything's happening with the baby, they would start blaming because you didn't. You should know these kinds of things. I was blamed, because you were working, you didn't quit your job, your irons were low, you had no proper nutrition. That's why it affected the baby and stuff like that. She's taking the baby out. It's just a small baby and it's kind of family pressure. They scare me too much, The baby's already tiny and anything can happen to her. So it's better to stay inside and just sit in the window, watch outside. And so Irfana sat at her window. When we spoke, her baby was 9 weeks old, and she had been sitting with the baby by her window, terrified of going out for a walk. In some cases, this anxiety was then a constant process of prioritizing infant over mother's own needs, a tussle between mother's difficulties with things and intense anxiety and responsibilization of mother doing anything and sacrificing anything to protect her infant. For Rena, such anxiety fueled social isolation and stringent self-imposed lockdown, resulting in missing her postnatal checks and her baby's vaccination appointments. I couldn't get my son weighed. We had his BCG appointment. For those of us who don't know, the BCG is the vaccination against tuberculosis. I had to cancel that because I didn't want to go to the hospital. I was too scared to go into the hospital to get his injection done. Two contrasting pulls then. One where mother might need the support from which she has been disconnected amidst blanket, non-tailored, non-localized measures, and the pull emerging from numerous layers of gendered maternal positionings where mother must protect infant and fetus at all costs. These contrasting pulls resulted always in mother prioritizing baby. As examples demonstrate, in some cases, these were exacerbated quite overtly by pressures from in-laws or pressures from partner. But in many cases, this was rationalized and presented as anxiety around the virus. But it was very evident that these pressures of intensive mothering were very much a part of this reasoning. So my point, to come back to the previous point, that such anxiety fits into broader societal expectations of maternal sacrifice and the fetal celebrity, putting mother over child as a priceless symbol of societal futures, leading to maternal obliteration and pressures to sacrifice maternal needs. Fieldwork showed that there were far-reaching impacts of such anxiety on maternal movements, on mothers' needs being met. and engaging with face-to-face healthcare appointments. So heightened was this imperative to protect the infant and protect the fetus. Last, I want to turn to the problems when we start looking at postnatal depression, postnatal anxiety, or any of these issues as individual problems, needing individual solutions, or indeed as just clinical problems alone. Because conditions of the pandemic impacted postnatal and antenatal maternity services by transforming and usually seizing support groups, infant weigh-in clinics, and amongst many other things, because these were called non-essential. And these saw intensified anxiety, not just in terms of protecting the fetus or infant, but it sat within a broader context of the retreat of the institutional, which, as I said, has been ongoing in the UK for a long time. And responsibility for such things has been passed back on to individuals. And as reminding you of the headlines that I talked about in terms of anxious mothers, you are harming your fetus, anxious mothers, you're harming your child. Now, much has recently been written on the individualization of parenting, including gendered pressures on parents to parent perfectly. So when the lockdown measures were introduced, apart from all of these struggles for themselves, an additional burden was taken on by mothers to kind of make up for all the developmental benefits that their children, that their babies aren't getting. So these babies in lockdown that wouldn't meet other babies, that wouldn't meet any people, the burden of suddenly socializing these babies perfectly was taken on by themselves. So Leah, for instance, says that I'm going to feel that there's going to be more pressure on us to recreate at home, to try and stimulate her, to encourage her development, encourage her learning. Everything that could be gained from going to parks, going to playgrounds, going to the zoo isn't going to happen, and is now going to have to be taken up by us to encourage that. Lockdown conditions for pregnancy and maternity broadly indicated to the participants that support was gone, suddenly gone overnight. This retreat, as perceived and experienced in the here and the now of the spring lockdown, the retreat of institutions of support, formal support, material spaces of camaraderie, that infant weigh-in clinic on the Thursday afternoon round the corner where somebody might see your face. That retreat made sense within the broader retreat that many mothers talk to me about, the pressure on health visitors or the pressure on midwives, the fact that they don't have much time. Why don't they have much time? Because of longer austerity and budget cuts. This retreat of the notion of support exacerbated by the pandemic meant people responsibilized themselves over and again. Ellen describes her antenatal mental health conversation as too impersonal. And she said it wasn't really a dialogue, like she was reading off a list online on the phone. It was quite impersonal. I did ask a few questions, but it was sort of very perfunctory answers and like just to get through the information. So I don't know if I'll be assigned to her for a postnatal check, but I have to say that it's really unfortunate that these are online, because I think, especially for first-time parents, you want some in-person reassurance. You want someone to, physically assess you, to look at the baby. For Salma, well, she found mental health support easily because she had a diagnosed condition and was already on the radar, so to speak. Support for feeding her baby and weighing her baby, which was essential for her anxieties to not exacerbate further, was impossible to find because sudden shutdowns. She tried 5 different routes, and every single step in the delay impacted her anxieties even further. These concerns were also voiced by Trisha, a first-time mother, indicating that the blanket restrictions that deemed everything non-essential, at things through a fetal lens rather than a maternal lens, meant that suddenly she had zero support. It's the little things, like health visits for the baby, not having those. They're done by over the phone. They're not even done by video chat. In her case, that was the case, which to me I find really odd because they can't see that she's healthy. Then I worry about all the babies that aren't being looked after properly. Nobody's checking in on them, and I shouldn't worry about that, but I do. But I ended up having to buy like vet scales, animal scales, just to weigh her. It's an anxiety all the time. Like, is she hitting her milestones? Is she growing a certain way? Sometimes the clearest finding about the limits of the rapid pivot to remote support in this particular instance was that sometimes, quite simply, it wouldn't do. And sometimes more tailored, more person-specific, more localized support was needed, where, as Trisha said, I wanted someone to see my face. So in about 7 of the 14 cases, for instance, mothers said that this remote support was not enough, and it impacted feeding decisions and anxiety in overpowering ways. So to conclude today, that the way we consider mental health has always been very, very clinical and individual, and the way we consider perinatal and postnatal and antenatal mental health has in general also been very individualized. And there has been a retreat of the institutional, as we've seen through austerity-related funding cuts, which have nothing to do with the pandemic, which predated this. And then the pandemic meant that further fetal and infant lens was applied, deeming services non-essential, and suddenly everything stopped for everybody, leaving the vulnerable more vulnerable than ever before. So the broad conclusions in terms of the impacts were that exacerbation of pre-existing divides, older inequalities, legacy inequalities were exacerbated. The mother became more invisible in blanket closures, in the redeployment of healthcare professionals, as their supporters were taken away and redeployed, as their spaces for their faces to be seen were shut down because they were non-essential. We once again prioritized the fetal celebrity and the infant as the celebrity, because whether these were non-essential for mothers was perhaps not considered. And finally, a lack of locally focused leadership, locally tailored, nuanced support meant that institutional presence retreated more and more and more, and the individual got more and more burdened within a broader context where we already look at maternal anxiety and maternal depression as an individual thing, an individual condition, and a responsibility of the mother that impacts children and fetuses. Now, for anybody here who is interested in the digital and right, what should we do then about this? Because I am a communication studies academic, I have not covered the digital turn today, but I will do so in my 2 next talks. On the 3rd of November, I'm speaking at the Applied Research Collaboration Kent, Surrey and Sussex NIHR launch event, a public event that anybody is free to attend, in a largely sort of biomedical practitioner audience about inequalities and complexities in this turn to digital for perinatal support, and how we can embed digital support into in-person provision in a nuanced way, in a way that's almost sort of cautiously optimistic. So I'm going to cover those practitioner recommendations on the 3rd of November. And on the 10th of December at the University of Huddersfield in their Media and Communications department, I'm going to do a paper called In Technology We Trust, Perinatal Mental Health and the Turn to Digital, where I'm going to critique the complex ways in which this sudden turn to digital affected people, both positives and negatives. So if you have a specific interest in recommendations or practice and policy, or the notion of the digital turn in the context of this, do contact me, because both those talks are free and completely online, and I'll be very happy to send you a link. And on that note, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Ranjana. I'm just now going to switch off record